Thank you. The question is that the bill be read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Perth.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I wish to indicate that the position of the Labor Party on this bill, as the previous speaker has indicated, is that we not oppose it. But we do have, in varying degrees, concerns and reservations about the proposal to amalgamate the Australian Institute of Criminology into the Australian Crime Commission. And I do want to acknowledge the work of the member for I don't know everyone's titles. The member for Batman's work that he has done to get some commitments for government about the retaining an element of independence for the staff of the former Institute of Criminology, and I don't think this could be. It is not possible to overstate the importance of this independence. My concern is that the stated intent of the government in ensuring that these agencies, in putting these agencies together, is to ensure that the research is more closely aligned with the operational requirements of the state, territory and federal law enforcement agencies. Now, I do think that is a concern. Now, of course, you want the research to be incredibly useful for those agencies, and it is entirely appropriate that you want to ensure that you are producing research that is useful for those agencies. But to say you want the research that is more closely aligned with the operational requirements of those agencies is, for me, somewhat troubling. That I am concerned that the ability for an independent body to produce data sets, to analyse those data sets in a way that might challenge some of the fundamental assumptions that have been made by law enforcement agencies, some of the more fundamental, the assumptions that have been made by the governments that are directing those law enforcement agencies, will be profoundly compromised by that. If you have a law enforcement agency who is very focused, as ours are, on the war on drugs, then any independent analysis of data that might suggest that perhaps a harm minimisation approach, or indeed an approach that we see emerging from in a number of different jurisdictions in North and South America, which is one of decriminalisation, the research and the analysis of data that would go to investigating the potential benefits of such a path might, of course, not be closely aligned with the operational requirements of a law enforcement agency that is very focused on the business as usual model. So I do think that there is a very, very real risk inherent in what we are proposing to do here with this amalgamation. And you want to. And it's very, very important that we have independent data, that we as policymakers in this place, and we're trying to grapple with many difficult issues around crime and law enforcement and social cohesion. I mean, we absolutely need the ability, both in government and in opposition, to have access to reliable and useful data. And I want to quote a very pre-eminent person in this area, Dr. Don Weatherburn, who is the Director of the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research in New South Wales. And Dr. Weatherburn has this to say: the abuse of crime statistics is so common, it has in some quarters engendered a great scepticism about them. The saying that there are lies, damn lies in statistics is probably nowhere more frequently uttered than in the context of crime statistics. We have to make judgments about the prevalence of crime, about trends in crime, about the distribution of crime, about the impact of government effects to prevent and control crime. We cannot base these judgments on personal experience and anecdote. They must be based on statistical information. And discussing this with my very good former colleague, Paul Papalia of the West Australian Parliament, he talks about the importance. He is our Labor's corrective services spokesperson, who's been doing an enormous amount of work in restorative justice and indeed focusing very much on evidence-based approach to crime and indeed in terms of crime and punishment and rehabilitation, and that he speaks very much of the institute, which unfortunately now has been closed down in Western Australia, the Crime Research Centre at UWA, which was established under by Joe Berenson, indeed, who was one of my predecessors as the member for Perth in this place, who went on to become a very esteemed Attorney General in Western Australia for a decade. And one of the things that he established was the Crime Research Centre at UWA, which was a joint initiative. And that for over 2 decades provided the highest quality information. They had access, because of the collaboration to government and the desire for government for an independent stream of analysis of the data, that provided a great resource for policy making, so that when people were getting on talkback radio and suggesting that perhaps we need to do this, perhaps we need mandatory sentencing, perhaps this would be the approach to go, that we actually had some mechanism for looking at what actually did work, for actually getting beyond the emotion that so often is involved in this notion of crime and punishment, and really look at the data and let the data deeply inform the decision-making process. Now, these are incredibly serious issues for social order and social cohesion. The idea that we should be flying blind, or that we should want our pre-eminent, national pre-eminent body involved in the analysis of the preparation of statistics and the analysis of crime to be subject to the operational alignment of enforcement agencies, I do think is deeply concerning. And just as I'm very concerned at the way in which the Barnett government has gradually withdrawn support from the centre in Western Australia, the Crime Research Centre, leading ultimately to UWA deciding to shut that centre down, I think that we need here to be very careful about what we are doing, and I do hope that this is an issue that is properly and fully scrutinised within the Senate committee, because it is in so many areas that we find in government, and I guess this is one of the things that I've probably found most disappointing in moving into the federal arena, is that how often there is a very clear lack of evidence available to guide policy, to guide policy, or to provide a justification in policy. And indeed, I'll just get on my little West Australian hobby horse again today. Today, I raised the issue of why it was that that we had the Grants Commission able to say that we're going to change fundamentally the allowance for remoteness. So, so in divvying up the GST, that we are no longer going to say that, well, the more remote you are, the more expensive it becomes to provide services. The remoteness factor will expire once you reach 1,274 kilometres. And so I prepared a series of questions to the agencies about why it would be that 1,254 kilometres would become the magical point, other than the fact that it's about the ultimate distance between Sydney and the boundary of New South Wales. But putting that one aside, why would this be chosen as the basis for ending remoteness? And they came back with an answer that was centred around, well, it seems intuitively right that at some point there must be a disconnect, that the connection between remoteness and cost would not be linear. It's intuitively felt. That is the basis on which West Australia was ripped off another $350 million in our GST take. So, and I can say over and over again, there are areas that one comes across where there really isn't sound statistics, there isn't sound evidence on which policy is based. Much of it is based on intuition, anecdote, gut, or perhaps popular sentiment. Now, it is important to take popular sentiment into account, but it's also important that we allow popular sentiment to be informed by real, rigorous analysis. I mean, people, my experience in many years in public life is that people actually want the right thing for this society, and they deserve to have good information. And I just want to perhaps finish by quoting the Emeritus Professor Ari Freiberg of the Faculty of Law at Murdoch University. And he talks about he says, first, as the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the premier statistical body in Australia, states on its website, statistics form the basis of our democracy and provide us with the necessary knowledge to assess the health and progress of our society. He goes on to say, they are fundamental to the task of holding government to account. Statistics must be public, accessible, valid and reliable, and governments owe it to their citizens to provide this information to enable them to understand and evaluate government policies. So I think that really sums up just how central this debate is. And as I say, I once again say that aligning, whilst I can see perhaps some short-term cost savings or some close collaborations developing between the Australian Crime Commission and our statistical body, that I believe that melding the Institute of Criminology so that it can align itself more closely with the objectives of law enforcement agency is a profoundly wrong insight. And as I say, I would hope that the government thinks about this very deeply, and indeed that the Senate does. Thank you.